Is an informational presentation on sea level rise adaptation efforts in the San Diego area and also on beach replenishment. Carrie Bath, an environmental scientist from our statewide planning unit, will talk about adaptation planning in the San Diego area, and Dr. Leslie Ewing, our coastal engineer, and Dr. Joe Street, our geologist, will talk about the different types of sand replenishment strategies that are available. So take it away, Carrie.
All right. Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm going to start us off by giving a short overview of sea level rise vulnerability in San Diego County. Commission staff geologist and engineer will then talk about beach sand replenishment as a sea level rise adaptation strategy. And then representatives from SANDAG will talk to you about their work on sand replenishment throughout the county. So taking a look at the county map, 10 cities occupy the county shoreline, along with the Port of San Diego, Camp Pendleton, and U.S. Navy facilities, and the Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve. Regional sea level rise models like Cosmos 3.0 can give us a broad look at the county's potential vulnerability to sea level rise. For example, this map shows potential vulnerability with 3.3 and 6.6 feet of sea level rise plus a 100-year storm event. The storm flood extent is shown in blue and yellow, and erosion vulnerability is shown in pink here. Fortunately, a lot of work is being done throughout the county at various scales to analyze these vulnerabilities further and to begin to adapt. San Diego County is particularly vulnerable in terms of people and infrastructure exposed to sea level rise. Over 35,000 residents and 255 miles of roads in the county are potentially vulnerable to 6.6 feet of sea level rise. The county also contains a large amount of vulnerable wetlands. 8.9 square miles are vulnerable to permanent inundation with 6.6 feet of sea level rise. I'm now going to run through a quick snapshot of each coastal city along the county shoreline, moving north to south roughly. Oceanside completed a vulnerability assessment in September 2018, which found that the small craft harbor and various commercial, industrial, and historical buildings are vulnerable. It also found that the South Coast Highway, routes 78 and 76, the railroad, and the La Salina wastewater treatment plant are vulnerable to flooding during extreme river flood events, and with sea level rise, flooding is expected to increase and become more frequent, which could lead to major service disruptions. The city is currently working on a sea level rise adaptation plan and an LCP update. The city of Carlsbad released a study in December 2017. It found that 1.6 miles of transportation assets will be highly vulnerable as early as 2050, and most of Carlsbad State Beach could be lost with 6.6 feet of sea level rise. Carlsbad is also working on an LCP update that will include measures to address sea level rise. The Encinitas city shoreline is approximately 6 miles long and made up of narrow sand and cobbled beaches backed by bluffs. And on the left side, there is a picture of the King Tide event in December 2018. In both Encinitas and Solana Beach, many assets are vulnerable. These pictures from Solana Beach show how the dry beach could be lost with high water levels, which is expected to become a problem as beaches are caught between rising sea levels and fixed lines of development like seawalls. The commission approved a 50-year Army Corps of Engineers beach replenishment project for Solana Beach and Encinitas to help maintain beaches in this area. Del Mar has done extensive work on sea level rise, including a vulnerability assessment, adaptation plan, sediment management plan, and wetland habitat migration assessment. And an LCP amendment on sea level rise and coastal hazards has been submitted to the commission. The studies from this show that without action, the dry beach could be lost to erosion with about 2 feet of sea level rise, at which point coastal storms will threaten the seawall integrity along the city's North Beach district, and increased flooding will inundate that neighborhood more frequently and at greater depths. It also found that bluff erosion could threaten the railroad with 1 foot of sea level rise. The city of San Diego is currently conducting a vulnerability assessment for city-owned assets. Many beaches and homes in the city are already experiencing hazards, and both are expected to increase with sea level rise. La Jolla Shores is shown here during a king tide. Torrey Pines State Beach is also a highly visited area, and the parking lot already floods because it's located at sea level. And these two pictures were taken during the December 2018 king tide and really illustrate how coastal access here could be affected by sea level rise. Imperial Beach faces unique challenges from sea level rise as it's surrounded on three sides by water and has a relatively high population of lower to moderate income residents. Imperial Beach completed a sea level rise assessment in 2016 and found that residential structures and parcels are the most exposed land use type to existing and future coastal hazards, but roads, public transit, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure also face growing risks. And adjacent wetlands could also be at risk, especially if they can't migrate inland and upland. The city is currently working on an LCP update to address these vulnerabilities. A lot of the work I just mentioned has been supported by state agency grants, including the local governments shown on the map on this slide. The Coastal Commission is now in its 6th round of the LCP Local Assistance Grant Program, and we've awarded almost $6 million to 37 jurisdictions throughout the state. And the 6th round of funding will be awarded in the coming months. In addition to local government work, other agencies and entities throughout the county have been working on sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation. The Port of San Diego, for example, completed a vulnerability assessment in June 2019, which included both the Port District's jurisdiction and the San Diego International Airport. The port also is working on a port master plan update and has formally agreed to coordinate with the U.S. Navy to work on sea level rise. In addition to the Port of San Diego, other trustees of public tidelands have completed sea level rise vulnerability assessments to fulfill the requirements of Assembly Bill 691, including Oceanside and the City of San Diego. Caltrans is also completing climate change vulnerability assessments for each district in California. And in September of this year, the report for District 11, where we are now, was completed, and it will be used to guide future highway resiliency planning. The airport also completed a climate resilience plan in June 2019, and SANDAG is also doing extensive work, which you heard about this morning, and you'll hear more about in just a few minutes. San Diego County is also a leader in regional collaboration. The San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative has produced many resources and reports and facilitated coordination throughout the region. And the Resilient Coastlines Project was recently launched with support from a NOAA grant, and it brings together the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative, the Climate Science Alliance, and the Tijuana River NER to work on regional resilience. So as you can see, a lot of work is going on throughout San Diego County to work on climate and sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation. Given the amount of work going on throughout the county, we may not have touched on everything in this presentation today. I'd also like to note that a lot of this information came from a 2016 commission staff project called the Statewide Vulnerability Synthesis, which provided a snapshot of the work being done in each coastal county, including San Diego. So if you're interested, you can download that from the Coastal Commission website. So that concludes our overview of sea level rise in San Diego County. As you heard throughout my presentation, one of the most common planning issues around sea level rise is the potential loss of beach area. Beaches trapped between fixed lines of development and rising seas are expected to narrow and eventually disappear. And one of the most common strategies to combat this issue is beach replenishment, where we add sand to the beach to build beach profiles up so that they can serve as a protective buffer between the ocean and development, while also maintaining beach area as a public access and recreational resource. However, there are some challenges and limitations associated with sand replenishment, so depending on the circumstances, it may not necessarily be an effective sea level rise adaptation strategy for the long term. I'll now turn the mic over to Dr. Joe Street, Commission Staff Geologist, and Dr. Leslie Ewing, our coastal engineer, who are going to dive into a more specific talk on these topics. Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie, and good afternoon, Commissioners. My role today is to provide an introduction to California's beeps. Wrong direction. No? Oh, we need to queue up the next set of slides. That's the ticket. Anyways, I'm going to try to provide you with a bit of a beach 101 before Dr. Ewing covers the main topics of beach replenishment and sand retention. I'll apologize in advance. I know some of you have already tested out of this course, but review is always good, so you can bear with me. This is the outline again. So as Carrie said, part of the impetus for this briefing is the awareness that traditional hard armoring approaches for protecting the coast and coastal development are associated with negative consequences for beach resources. And this is only going to be exacerbated with sea level rise. And there's the hope that soft approaches like sand replenishment can protect development and help sustain the beaches. It's an appealing concept. It's an apparent win-win, but as Carrie alluded to, it's not always so simple on the ground. The main point I want to try to convey today is that beaches are dynamic features and utterly unlike armoring structures in that regard. Beaches are embedded in a set of shoreline processes involving the movement of sediment to, from, and along the coast. Changes in physical conditions, be it wave climate, sand supply, barriers to sand transport, are going to affect beaches over time. Sand replenishment and retention efforts are themselves interventions in the shoreline system, and their outcomes are going to turn on how well we understand the local context of beach change. I wish I had time to talk about all of the different geologic factors that shape the coastline, but suffice to say that California's position along an active plate boundary allows for a wide diversity of beach environments. Many people will first think of the wide, heavily used beaches of Santa Monica and Ocean Beach in San Francisco, which I showed before, when they first think of the California coast. But we all know that the narrower beaches backed by bluffs and pocket beaches protected by headlands are equally characteristic of our coast. I bring this up because different beach types are indicative of the geologic setting, the wave environment, and the natural availability of sand, which are all factors that are going to influence beach replenishment efforts as well. So what is a beach? It seems like a trivial question, but there is more to that lump of sand than meets the eye. A beach includes not just the areas above the waterline, but also intertidal and subtidal reaches. And the anatomy of the beach matters. For example, a wide, gradual beach with a broad subtidal reach is likely to be more protective of bluffs or development and more resistant to the effects of rising sea level than a narrow beach with deeper water and high wave exposure. The slope, width, volume, and sediment composition of a beach is mostly controlled by sediment availability and wave conditions. For example, the average grain size of beach sediment is a direct function of the amount of wave energy experienced at a site. A few sand samples from California beaches are shown on the right, reflecting a range of wave regimes. And of course, sand isn't really a prerequisite for a beach. A lot of the highest energy environments in the state will be partially made up of pebbles or cobbles. And at the other end of the spectrum, in bays and estuaries, if the beaches occur at all, they'll tend to have a mix of sand and finer materials. And of course, at some beaches, there'll be a basal layer of cobbles that lies beneath the sand. It's hidden most of the time, but may become exposed during the winter or during large storms. And this greatly changes the character and the recreational value of a beach when this happens. Neighboring beaches can have rather different wave conditions, which is reflected in the grain sizes in the beach slopes. Monastery Beach, which is just south of Carmel, consists of very coarse sand. The Carmel Submarine Canyon is just offshore, and the beach is exposed to large, highly energetic waves. This is also indicated by the steep slope of the beach, and it's a popular diving beach, and apparently there's a sort of a site-specific move that divers have to use here because it's so steep. They get out of the water and kind of crawl up the beach like, the first fish that, ventured out of the ocean. So. Meanwhile, Carmel Beach, just a few miles up coast, is a finer grained beach with a gentle slope and lower energy waves. Both research and practical experience have shown that the grain size of the sediment placed during beach replenishment efforts has a strong bearing on the lifespan of the placed material. So something to keep in mind. Now, I've been focused, being a geologist, on the physical aspects of beaches, but a more complete answer to my question, what is a beach, is that beaches are complex ecosystems in their own right. Both natural and human-caused changes to beaches, including beach replenishment, have major effects on beach ecosystems and the species that depend on them. At this point, I want to turn to the broader shoreline processes that support the existence of beaches and drive beach change over time. As shown in this figure, sand moves to, from, and along the coast within geographically limited segments or compartments known as littoral cells. Within each of these littoral cells, sand is delivered to the coast by a series of sources, including river discharge and bluff erosion, and is lost from the system to a variety of sand sinks. Between these endpoints, sand is transported on and offshore by waves, but also moves laterally, resulting in the redistribution of sand within the cell. Rivers and streams are the dominant source of sand to the coast. Several of the larger watersheds, including the Eel River in the North Coast and the Santa Clara River in Ventura County, can carry vast loads of sediment during storms, sometimes resulting in huge coastal sediment plumes that you can see from space. However, the construction of dams and diversion of natural river flows has drastically reduced the delivery of sand from coastal streams. In Southern California in particular, it's estimated that the riverine sand source has been cut in half since the 19th century. An important secondary sand source, and in some places where stream flow is scarce, the dominant source is from the erosion of bluffs by wave action. In more developed coastal areas, this sand source too has been reduced by the construction of seawalls and other protective devices that reduce natural shoreline erosion. Sand reaching the shoreline may be deposited on the beach or in adjacent offshore areas, or it can be transported laterally by longshore currents. These currents are caused by waves approaching the shoreline at an angle, usually from the northwest. This drives north to south littoral drift of sand in most cells in most seasons. However, northward littoral drift does occur in some locations and at certain times of the year in response to southerly waves. Natural headlands and other artificial structures like groins and harbors disrupt this littoral drift and cause sand deposition on the updrift side of the barrier. Pardon me. Sand is eventually removed from a littoral cell via several sand sinks. Strong wave action can remove sand offshore, and this sand may be slow to return. In some locations, beach sand is also blown inland and deposited in dune fields, where it can remain for hundreds or thousands of years. Irreversible sand losses occur when sand moving alongshore encounters one of the many submarine canyons that cut across the continental shelf. Here, sand literally drains from the coast into deep ocean alluvial fans. Oops, that didn't work. There we go. In a real sense, the beaches within a littoral cell are temporary repositories of sand. Like a bank account, beach sand is added or removed over time. With enough data, a rough sand budget can be drawn up for a beach or an entire littoral cell, and these budgets will account for the sand moving in and out of the system. When the new sand supply exceeds sand losses, beaches will accrete or grow larger. Where a sand deficit develops, beaches will erode. Past beach replenishment efforts have been motivated, at least in part. Oops. Having trouble using my left hand for the clicker.
That's your right hand.
Well, that's why I have to keep switching back. All right, where am I? Sand budgets. On our left is an absolutely illegible sand budget. So sand deficits at individual beaches or along longer stretches of the coast will arise from large storm events or from longer-term changes in sand budgets that result from natural shifts in the wave climate. However, in many cases, human interference with sand sources or littoral drift has caused or exacerbated these problems. Within their littoral cells and subject to the balance of their sand budgets, beaches experience seasonal and long-term changes in shape, volume, and position. Beaches typically expand during the spring and summer months and shrink during the fall and the winter due to changing wave conditions. Beach volumes and width also fluctuate from year to year. in response to changes in wave conditions and sand supply. So a repeated theme, you may have noticed. And in this case here, beaches in Imperial Beach have also been subject to sand replenishment efforts that influence the shape and the volume of the beach. Over many years, longer-term trends in beach conditions can become apparent. I'll just end by reminding you that accelerated sea level rise is likely to have profound effects on beach conditions. As a general matter, sea level rise is expected to result in the inland and upslope migration of beaches where they have the space to move, and the narrowing, steepening, and potential loss of beaches where they are confined. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Ewing to discuss beach sand replenishment.
We have the same presentation just to follow on, please. Thank you. Unless I turned it off myself. Ah, there. And as Carrie and Joe have both discussed, we know that beaches are wonderful habitat, great recreational and access areas. They also do provide shore protection. And we understand that with sea level rise, concern by many communities about the increased risks from erosion and flooding that will occur, they're looking at the options for using their beaches for shore protection and ways to enhance that in the future. But I want to step back because I want to talk about different ways to address hazards. The first thing is to avoid placing development in harm's way. That is one adaptation strategy that we have before us. Another is, another is to move the development away or find ways to relocate away from where the hazard is located. Of course, we do know about building barriers to provide protection from those hazardous conditions, but then there's also the idea of moving the hazard away from the development. That's what beaches do. Beaches cause the waves to break further offshore, buffering the wave energy and protecting the development that's in the back shore. Now, at times, communities are going to find that their beaches are not adequate to address that, to provide the sort of buffering capacity that they need. They, of course, can rely on those first three options. Don't put things in harm's way, move away from harm's way, or put up barriers. But then there's also the option of using beach nourishment, of actually widening the beaches, adding sand to the beaches so they get back to providing the capacity that they had been providing before. So beach replenishment, beach nourishment helps to move hazards away from those things we would hope to protect. And we've done a lot of beach nourishment. These pictures don't go with the slides at all, but that's okay. And that doesn't help either. One of the things we've experienced, and very significantly, is the identification of beach nourishment as helping to expand beaches. The top picture to the right is Santa Monica back in the 1930s. People who've been to Santa Monica today know that there's a huge wide beach that's there. But then we also have beach nourishment going on at Oceanside and other areas of the coast. We can look for sand for replenishment in a number of different locations. There's sand that can come from harbors themselves. This is not the presentation I did. We've also got sand that can come from inland locations, inland areas where it's quarried and brought to the beach. This is what Broad Beach is proposing to do. And then there's also sand that can come from river areas. We can carry sand down from the rivers. We can bring it to the beach by pipelines and move it also by trucks and rail cars. But what we're also finding is that there's a lot of sand being moved by dredges and moved along the beach areas. All this will have effects on the beach and influence the characteristics of actually the nourishment. They each have their own impacts and can be a significant concern sometimes in how you get sand, how you move the sand, and how you place the sand and where the sand is placed. A lot of communities are proposing to rely upon dredged material for their sand. And I just wanted to walk you through some of the steps of what that means, what it looks like to have material taken from a dredge area offshore and brought to the beach. And so this is from the Regional Beach Sand Project that the folks from SandAg will be talking about in just a second. This is the dredge, the material coming up onto the dredge. And then that pipeline you see is actually after the dredge is filled in its hole, the dredge moves to a pipeline, and then the sand is pumped from that pipeline onto the beach. You can see sand being placed on the beach, and in the very distance, there would have been the dredge there. Another way that sand can be placed onto the beach from a dredge is for it to be sprayed. This is called a rainbow system. It can be brought onto the beach or into the nearshore that way. And then finally, there are dredges that have split holes where the boat, the bottom opens up. And so the boat gets into narrower or shallower water, and the sand will be dropped, and then nearshore currents will bring the sand up onto shore and allow for it to be brought to the beach by wave conditions. When you see projects for beach nourishment, you get them in several different ways. Much of our nourishment historically has been coming from harbor dredging and then placement of sand down coast. That harbor dredging is usually being done by the Corps of Engineers or the U.S. Navy, a federal agency, and so they'll be coming to you as a federal consistency project. And that's one of the many ways you'll see beach nourishment projects. Another is through coastal development permits. The Broad Beach Project, which included a lot of beach nourishment in it, was brought to you as a CDP. And then finally, there are these type of permits we've been issuing for several years now, probably a dozen years actually, called opportunistic beach sand projects. These are when a community has several locations they know they want to have sand placed, but they don't have specifically identified sources yet for the sand that we placed on the beach. And so they put a permit together that says, we want to place sand in these several places. We'd like to place up to 50,000 cubic yards a year or 200,000 cubic yards over a time of 5 years. We want the sand to be of a certain quality, and we'll do it during these times of year under these various conditions. We don't know where we're getting this sand yet, and we want permission to be able to do this with very quick review. And so we have issued what are called opportunistic beach projects or SCOOP projects, and we get a 30-day review period to make sure that those projects are within the constraints that have already been placed on them in that broader permit. So it's not really a blanket, go out and do what you want, but it's a blanket, do what you've said you're going to do in a responsible way. And so we do have these opportunistic projects as well. They tend to be smaller amounts of sand, and they tend to complement other efforts for nourishment rather than themselves being the only source of sand that a community might rely on. Communities are starting to realize, though, that sand is, first of all, it's very expensive, and it's sometimes hard to come by. Some places are starting to run out of sand, like Florida is starting to find that they can't find offshore sand. And even if you can find offshore sand, it's expensive for us. In California, it's between $1 and $2 million simply to mobilize a dredge. So that just to get a dredge there, if you can find somebody who will buy that first cubic yard of sand for you at $1 to $2 million cubic dollars, then the rest of it's kind of affordable. But most of these projects are in the many millions of dollars because you have to be able to get enough sand to cover that first $1 to $2 million initial mobilization. So finding that this is starting to become a very expensive proposition, communities are honestly asking ways to retain the sand that they have or the sand that they are going to get through nourishment. And there we're looking toward nature to see how we already start to save sand on the beaches. Dunes are one of those systems. And we're starting to see projects come before us. They're like the Cardiff Living Shoreline Project. That's a dune system that's been created to hold sand on the beach and function as a natural dune where it supplies sand to the beach when it's needed, and then the beach provides sand back into the dune during times when there's excess sand on the beach. Communities also have been putting in berms, temporary berms for the winter, which provide flood protection. Again, sort of a berm-like, a dune-like feature that's being put in that sort of mimics what the dunes are already doing in a natural setting. We've also seen that there are also lots of ways that there are barriers to sand transport along the coast. These cuspet features or even longer structures are holding the sand in place under natural conditions. Point Dume holds a lot of sand. It's equivalent almost to some of these smaller structures in Santa Cruz that are natural features that are holding sand. Or then in the Newport area, this is a groin field. This is a constructed way of holding and retaining sand on the beach. This is the groin at El Segundo that was placed as a single structure, and it was done intentionally to hold sand so that it would cover the oil pipeline that goes from the offshore anchorage area to the marine terminal inland, and to keep that from being destroyed by wave energy. We also have breakwaters. These are structures that cut down on the wave energy coming to shore, and they cause sand to deposit inland of them because the wave energy has been dropped, and waves carry sand because they have energy. If waves have no energy, or if the water that's behind there has no energy, it can't carry the sand. And so the sand is deposited. Santa Monica is a classic example of that, where there's a huge beach because of the Santa Monica breakwater that was installed initially to be an anchorage. It works so well at dropping sand, very few boats can anchor there because it's too shallow. And this is then the breakwater at Venice, and then also Santa Monica from the water, where you can see there's a huge amount of sand that is developed there because of these structures. There's a lot of future ideas, though, for retention. Those of you who know Santa Monica, this is from the Amundsen House. This white line is where the shoreline used to be. And then I stood on that white line and I turned 90 degrees toward the ocean. And I took a picture of the beach and where the ocean is today. And you can sort of see it in the distance. If I were 6 or 7 feet tall, maybe you could see it better. But you can get the idea that there's a huge beach there now that didn't exist in the 1930s when a lot of the development started in this part of Santa Monica. Now, this is one of the areas I've been very fascinated by. This is a beach in Italy. And all of these little lines are breakwaters. And then other of the little lines, the breakwaters are the ones that are running parallel to the shoreline, and then there are groins that are running perpendicular to the shoreline. All that color is people with beach umbrellas. And it is the idea of sand retention to the max. To me, this is sort of the extreme you can go to in the idea of sand retention. I understand that communities are going to want to look at ways to do sand retention. We might put this up as a poster child for sort of, this is maybe going too far, but perhaps not. But we do need to think about ways to do sand retention. One of the things that Santa Monica is doing is planting some of their dunes so that the sand will stay fixed and it will be starting to develop a topographic relief. There are good and bad points to sand retention structures. I'm not going to go into the engineering requirements and the engineering constraints that they have, but I do want to point out that they do have a lifetime. There's a time which they may have to come out. This is a groin from Santa Barbara that has clearly been there past its time. There are problems with thinking about we're just going to hold all the sand that we have. Beaches are going to be a great asset for communities going forward. Beach nourishment is going to be a great way to enhance our beaches, and beach retention structures are also going to be tools that help with that. But I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that there's a limit to the amount of sand we're going to have available. As I mentioned, Florida is starting to run out of sand. We have to think about what happens next and how we're going to gracefully and in kindness to our coast, not leave it with a lot of structures that are not going to be effective in the future. And so that's the other part of beach nourishment and sand retention that has to be considered. It's not that it's a problem with beach retention and sand nourishment per se, but that these have to be thought of within the larger context of the time period over which they're going to be effective. So with that, I will like to invite up our next speakers. It's wonderful that we've had Sarah Pierce and Greg Herron able to come with Sandag and Coastal Frontiers. We're in their backyard, and they're going to tell us about some of the projects in San Diego that have been going on dealing with sand projects. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Is the mic on? It is, right? Okay. Well, thank you, Carrie, Leslie, Joe, for those remarks. Yes. Thank you, Carrie, Leslie, and Joe, for your remarks. You really teed us up very nicely for our presentation today. My name's Sarah Pierce. I'm an environmental planner with the San Diego Association of Governments, and I'm here today with Greg Herron from Coastal Frontiers Corporation. And we're here today to present just an overview of Sandag's role in beach nourishment in our region, and also an update on kind of where we are with sea level rise planning. Greg and I will likely use the terms beach nourishment and beach replenishment interchangeably throughout the presentation today, so they both mean the same thing, adding sand to our beaches. So this is just an outline of what we're going to discuss today. I'm just going to give a brief update on who Sandag is. I know you heard from our executive director earlier this morning. I'll provide some information on our shoreline preservation working group and the regional policies that really establish Sandag's role in the coastal arena here. And then we'll provide an overview of the 2 regional beach sand nourishment projects that Sandag has managed on behalf of the local cities here in San Diego, and some information on how those projects have performed over time. And we'll end with an overview of how Sandag is working with our local partners to address sea level rise. So Sandag is the metropolitan planning organization for the San Diego region. We have representatives from the 18 cities and the county government of San Diego on our board of directors, along with a number of advisory members from local entities like the San Diego Unified Port District, the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, and our local transit operators as well. So we're a public agency that helps to really kind of navigate regional decision-making here in the San Diego area. We help build consensus, make strategic plans, obtain and allocate resources, plan, engineer, and build public transportation projects, and also provide information on a broad range of topics that are pertinent to our region's quality of life. So our board of directors is supported by a number of working groups and committees who make recommendations to the board of directors on specific subject matter areas. And one of the oldest running working groups at Sandag is the Shoreline Preservation Working Group, which actually started in the 1980s as the Shoreline Erosion Committee. So they've had a little bit of a name change over time. And the working group includes elected officials from our local coastal cities, as well as advisory members from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, California State Parks, Surfrider Foundation, and staff from our local San Diego Coastal Commission office, among others. And the working group's guiding principles include committing to a unified approach for local decisions on sand replenishment and the management of sediment resources, promoting opportunities for beach sand replenishment and other sea level rise adaptation strategies, and of course, regional cooperation and coordination. So the photos here are from March of 2019. The working group went on a little field trip up to the Cardiff Living Shorelines project in the city of Encinitas. And Leslie alluded to this before. That coastal dune system is helping to protect the roadway up there on Highway 101. So the working group has a long history of guiding the development of shoreline management policies in the San Diego region. Dating back to 1993, we have our shoreline preservation strategy, which proposes an extensive beach building and maintenance program for critical shoreline erosion areas in our region. That was followed in 2001 by the sand retention strategy, which concluded that some sand retention structures in our area have the potential to increase the cost effectiveness of beach replenishment because they help to retain that sand. The Sand Compatibility and Opportunistic Use Program, or SCOOP as we like to call it, and we talked about this earlier in the presentation, and that presents just a scale for implementing small-scale opportunistic sand replenishment projects in our area. And then finally, 2009, the Coastal Regional Sediment Management Plan, which aims to implement our shoreline preservation strategy by establishing a process to address beach erosion through effective management of the sediment resources in our region. So the policy documents that I just mentioned have really helped to shape 2 regional beach sand nourishment projects that SANDAG has managed. The first project was completed in 2001. About 2.1 million cubic yards of sand were placed on our region's beaches, 12 beaches from Oceanside in the north to Imperial Beach in the south part of our county. And beach quality sand was dredged from 6 offshore borrow site areas. And funding for that project was provided by the U.S. Navy, the California Division of Boating and Waterways, and of course our region's coastal cities provided matching funds for that as well. So this is a picture from Imperial Beach, 2001, prior to any beach nourishment happening. You can see a fairly eroded beach there, the cobble exposed. Leslie showed some pictures of nourishment happening, and this is just another version of that. You can see the dredge off in the distance in the water there, the pipes bringing that sand onto the beach, and then the heavy earth moving equipment that really helped to shape and sculpt what that beach is going to look like. And then this is actually a shot from a very similar spot after the beach nourishment project. So you can see a much wider beach there in Imperial Beach. And then the second project that SANDAG managed was completed in 2012, and this was a slightly smaller scale project. About 1.5 million cubic yards of sand were placed on 8 beaches in our region. Again, the northernmost beach in Oceanside, the southernmost beach in Imperial Beach. Sand was dredged from 3 offshore areas, and funding for that project was again provided by the California Division of Boating and Waterways and matching funds from our region's coastal cities. This is a before and after shot from the Bataguitos receiver site in the city of Carlsbad, and particularly on the south end of both of those pictures, you can see the difference in how wide that beach became after that nourishment project. One of the key differences between these 2 projects was that a slightly coarser grained sand was used in this second project, the idea being that it might stick around on the beach for a little bit longer. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Greg, who's going to provide some information on our regional shoreline monitoring program and how the sand that we've added to our system has changed over time.
So SANDAG's been conducting a shoreline monitoring program for the better part of 25 years. It's the longest running continuous monitoring program of its type in Southern California and perhaps even California itself. So what we're doing is keeping track of the beaches, identifying long-term and short-term trends, and trying to understand the impacts of human intervention, such as beach nourishment, and natural events such as El Nino. The program consists of beach monitoring and lagoon entrance monitoring, and today we'll just talk about the beach portion of that. So the shoreline monitoring program consists primarily of beach profile surveys. We look at 61 sites between Oceanside Harbor in the north and the U.S.-Mexico border in the south, conduct surveys in the fall and the spring. So that's corresponding to the beginning and end of the winter wave season. And as Dr. Street showed in his presentation, we would expect to see our widest beaches in the fall and our narrowest, our most eroded beaches in the spring after the winter wave season. The graphic on the left is just a nice cartoon of how a beach profile survey is conducted. And you have a crew working on the beach measuring the seabed elevations and a crew working from offshore in a boat, and they meet somewhere outside of the surf zone. And what you end up with is a beach profile, which is essentially a cross-section of the beach. And from that, we can measure the mean sea level beach width. That's a pretty easy concept, the width of the dry sandy beach, but also the shore zone volume. So that's the amount of sand in the system from the back of the beach out to the depth of closure, where sand's not really being moved around much anymore by waves and currents. That's the outer boundary of these littoral cells that Dr. Street was talking about. So I want to share with you some results, but bear with me for 2 quick slides to give you a little bit of background to put those results into context. SANDAG study area is Oceanside down to the U.S.-Mexico border. We have portions of 3 littoral cells in our study area, the Oceanside cell in the north, Mission Beach cell, and the Silver Strand cell. And as Dr. Street indicated, these are sort of closed compartments of sand that have their own unique sediment inputs, sediment sinks or losses, and transport paths. And they're closed, so there's no communication, for example, between the Oceanside cell and the Mission Beach cell. There has been quite a bit of nourishment conducted here in the San Diego region. This figure shows the cumulative amount of material placed in each of the 3 littoral cells since 1994. Why 1994? Well, that's the beginning of Sandag shoreline preservation strategy. So in the Oceanside cell, about 6 million cubic yards of material placed on the beach, much less in the Mission Beach cell, about 500,000, and in the Silver Strand cell, about 1.5 million. The 2 projects that jump out at you here and are labeled are Regional Beach Sand 1 and Regional Beach Sand 2, conducted in 2001 and 2012. The rest of the projects are from opportunistic nourishment. So again, that's material that became available from projects whose purpose wasn't necessarily beach building. Some examples of these in the Oceanside cell in the late 1990s, dredging or restoration of Botaquitos Lagoon put a lot of material on the beach. And then at the far end of the chart up high, San Elijo Lagoon Restoration Project, which is still ongoing right now, put about 300,000 cubic yards on the beach. Elsewhere in the Silver Strand and Mission Beach cells, the opportunistic nourishment there typically comes from a Corps of Engineers dredging of Mission Beach or deepening of San Diego Harbor, and it makes it onto the beach. Much better there than somewhere else, like much further offshore. So let's take a look at the evolution of some San Diego beaches in the last 2 decades, and this encompasses the Regional Beach Sand 1 and Regional Beach Sand 2. And it was really a quite varied outcome along the coast, with some areas like Cardiff performing extremely well. The graphic up in the upper left shows beach width and shore zone volume changes. Beach width is blue, shore zone volume is red, relative to 2000. That's the baseline condition or pre-nourishment condition before Sandag started these regional beach sand projects. So anything above the heavy black line is a gain, anything below is a loss. And we can see here with Cardiff, we had gains attributable to the first regional beach sand project. We largely maintained those to the second one where we had additional gains. And then at the far end of the graph, we see gains again from the San Elijo Lagoon Restoration Project opportunistic nourishment. So this is an example of an area that did very well over the past 2 decades doing this during this regional beach sand period. Another example of Oceanside. This is a location where we had, we'll call it transient gains or transient benefits for shorter periods of time. So we see here at Oceanside, we received these gains in both volume and beach width right after Regional Beach Sand 1, maintained those for a period of 5 to 7 years, after which a trend of erosion prevailed. And by the time we got to Regional Beach Sand 2, we see gains, but it just barely even got us back up to where we were in 2000. And then we had the trend of erosion take over again. So periods of 5 to 7 years worth of benefits from these projects. South Carlsbad is an example of a place that, even though we place sand in Regional Beach Sand 1 and 2, we just haven't been able to build a beach there or keep it where we wanted to. So you just see this trend of erosion occurring over this 18-year period. So we're about 50 feet narrower now than we were when we started. So those are 3 general examples of how the beaches perform. This table just puts all of our reaches into context here and shows how long each one of them had these gains in beach width and shore zone volume in this post-RBSP era. Again, places like Cardiff maintain wider beaches and more sand in the system for 18 years. That's as long as the period goes. North Carlsbad did very well. Solano Beach, Mission Beach. On the other end of the spectrum, South Carlsbad, as we saw, we just couldn't keep sand there despite placing it at the site. And then we have places like Oceanside, Del Mar, Imperial Beach that had sand for shorter periods right after each project. So the project fulfilled its purpose of building beaches, but we just weren't able to keep it there as long as other places. With that, let me hand it back over to Sarah, who's going to finish up and talking about sea level rise adaptation in the region.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So I just wanted to highlight briefly that the replenishment projects that we have completed here in San Diego, both the 2 large regional beach sand nourishment projects as well as the smaller opportunistic projects that have been completed in our region, are being studied by local researchers. This is an article that was published in the San Diego Union Tribune in February of 2017, and it summarizes some of the conclusions from a paper that was published in the Nature Communications Journal about the impacts of the 2015-2016 El Nino on beaches on the West Coast. And the article explains that 3 of the beaches in our San Diego region that were nourished with sand during that 2012 project seemed to fare better during that El Nino period than beaches that were not nourished. And this is an important lesson for us locally because beach nourishment is identified as a near-term sea level rise adaptation strategy in many of our local jurisdictions' adaptation plans. And wide beaches, of course, not only benefit the public and the economy by driving tourism and recreation, but they also provide critical protection to businesses, homes, coastal infrastructure. And so I wanted to conclude today with just a brief mention of some work that SANDAG has been doing recently. In December of 2017, we were awarded funding through the Caltrans Adaptation Planning Grant Program to begin looking at how sea level rise was going to impact regional transportation facilities. So thinking about highways, bikeways, our rail system that kind of crosses jurisdictional lines and really serves our whole region. Many local jurisdictions in our region, as you heard from Carrie, have already completed or are in the process of completing sea level rise vulnerability assessments, but this funding really gave us an opportunity to look at sea level rise from a regional perspective. So with this funding, we've also taken a look at the SANDAG policy documents that I mentioned earlier to see where they might need to be adjusted to accommodate for sea level rise. We've documented best sea level rise planning practices and lessons learned from local jurisdictions. And we've also assembled a toolkit, which is really kind of a compilation of local and regional measures that might be utilized to mitigate sea level rise in the future. So this project will wrap up in the spring of 2020, and it's really important for our region because this is going to help us start a regional dialogue on how jurisdictions can work to get together to address adaptation needs and how SANDAG may help to facilitate or develop future projects or policies that address sea level rise. And this morning in public comment, you heard from our executive director who mentioned the 5 big moves and how those 5 concepts are really driving the next iteration of San Diego Forward, which is our regional plan. And this work that we're doing here will inform that regional plan moving forward. So with that, well, thank you for your time today, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Staff, do you have anything to add? Not a thing. Okay. Commissioner Brownsy and then Commissioner Rice. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we start, I do have cards. I'm sorry. I overlooked my cards. Julia Chun and Laura Walsh.
Thank you. I should have a slideshow coming up shortly.
Okay. And how much time do you need?
This is for Laura Walsh.
Okay.
Just 2 minutes.
2
Minutes, please.
2? Would you? Yeah. Okay. 3's fine.
Grace. While that's coming up, Laura Walsh with Surfrider Foundation San Diego County. We just want to thank you guys for including this item in the agenda. It's a really great way of characterizing the adaptation needs and activities going on in our region, so thank you for that. Is there a, okay. Cool. So we're here to demonstrate support for efforts to encourage proactive planning for sea level rise, which was of course intended to be a specific focus of local coastal program updates around California and in this community. It's up on this slide, but Coastal Commission sea level rise guidance, of course, includes principles that clearly preclude the need for proactive sea level rise planning. Additionally, beach nourishment was kind of always considered a Band-Aid solution. It can be a great short-term solution, but it does have limited effectiveness in this community. It's becoming increasingly more expensive, especially in light of the fact that tomorrow's storms will be bigger than today's, and it can also have unintended consequences. So I just included some graphs here from California's 4th climate change assessment, and what we can draw from this really is that we are in the planning time window now where we have the chance to enact proactive strategies for planning for sea level rise. Additionally, something that gets overlooked is that we're also already seeing extreme water level events already happening. So even with minimal sea level rise, we're seeing these high water level events have impacts. And our vulnerabilities to such events are becoming well documented through this vulnerability assessment process. And there are threats to coastal access, public health, and public safety. So again, we heard some great items today about what might happen here with around 6 feet of sea level rise, but really just in the short term in these vulnerability assessments, we see miles of road impacted. There's 2 miles of road in Carlsbad. In Imperial Beach, where we have a lot of water quality issues already, there's 5 pump stations that are vulnerable to flooding. And in Oceanside, lifeguard headquarters are vulnerable to wave run-up. And so just as these vulnerabilities become more revealed, we're going to see more of a call for beach nourishment projects. We can already see there's a trend for more expensive projects. North County is planning a 50-year beach nourishment project. And also, as has been discussed, there's been a lot of opportunistic projects. And so we just wanted to remind the commission today that there's been so much work done to talk about, the suite of adaptation strategies that are available to proactively address sea level rise, and putting all our eggs in one basket of protection when this is what our coast looks like with so many assets near the coast, is really not the most proactive solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Does Julia Chun want to speak? There you are. How many minutes?
3 would be great. So thank you. I'm speaking to you today as a resident of San Diego County, and I just wanted to come as someone who has lived through many of these beach nourishment projects, including RBSB2, who's been to all the stakeholder meetings in each of the cities, IB, Oceanside, Del Mar, all the rest of it, reviewed many of those plans, and someone who's watched the Coastal Commission wrestle with these difficult issues. And just here to implore you to continue to be proactive instead of reactive. You gave out those grants for a very good reason. We know a crisis is coming to our coast, and a lot of these efforts are underway, but we have to beg the question, are they fulfilling the intent of that original impetus that caused this to move forward? So we are seeing progress. I just wanted to speak briefly about beach nourishment because that's something that a lot of folks in our county are hanging their hat on. Everybody's singing about beach nourishment. With RBSB2, that took a long time to permit and fund and coordinate with all the different cities involved, and that's just beach nourishment. That's not as complicated as some of the other things that are considered as we deal with sea level rise. For instance, there's a limited amount of sand, and that's one of the reasons I'm always advocating for these long planning horizons. It's in everybody's best interest to start early and engage now, making sure that we're continuing to have a science-based discussion as well. And then, for instance, in Imperial Beach, with that last big beach nourishment project, there were some unintended consequences that were rectified, but there was some coastal flooding. There was some impacts to life safety and lifeguards because the slope got really steep and it became very hard to see swimmers in the water, hard for young children, things of that nature. And so I know I only have 3 minutes, but I just wanted to come respond to what was said today, keep this conversation going. Someone who's seeing the broader impacts of each of these coastal cities, and as you've heard today in public comment, each of the cities is watching the other cities as well. What else did I want to hit in response today? I think we also have to be mindful of, some progress is better than none, but making sure that we keep that long-term view in mind and not just settling on short-term plans. And I think that was about it. Some of these conversations also remind me of why we need to get the rails off of the bluff in Del Mar, because we're going through this process to armor a situation where it can only be single-tracked at best. Blocks public access, people die there every year, we're spending all this money, when, like we heard from the director of SANDAG earlier, it would make so much more sense to invest in the long-term solution of moving it off the bluffs where you could double track, we could increase ridership, and so forth. So I'm just going to be your little champion and come back and remind you when you're close of the big picture and the things that are so important in this long-term discussion. Thank you. Available for questions if you have any.
Thank you. Commissioner Brownsey.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. For the SANDAG representatives, and so, whoever, Have you looked at, have you done any research, or do you have estimates for the costs of beach nourishment for the San Diego area?
I mean, it would probably depend on the size of the project. As was just shown in the last slide from Surfrider, about $17.5 million for that first project that was completed, around $25 million for the second project that was completed. Of course, numbers have changed over time, and so I would imagine to do something similar these days would be a little bit more expensive than that.
Okay, so that's a no, that you don't have the estimates for the region?
It would, yeah, we don't have an estimate for the region because we don't have a project that we're working toward at the moment where we could cost that.
But have you ever thought about just doing some research and just collecting that data? Because I think that would be helpful to get a sense of what communities have spent up to this point, and then looking ahead in terms of estimates. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense. There was a cost study that was done for the second regional beach sand project where 4 different options were looked at, and they were cost out. I mean, everything from permitting to design to monitoring and construction. And so we do have those, numbers that we can look at, and we can maybe think about adjusting those for inflation over time to get some thoughts on if there were another project, what it might cost.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the reason that I'm asking, and I'm going to ask a couple more questions, is that I think that one of the very critical issues is that we start to really come to grips with some of the costs, or as many of the costs as we can, with respect to sea level rise, what that's going to mean for individual communities like Del Mar or Oceanside or Carlsbad. And then what's that going to mean as a region? Because it will be with that data, then I think that will assist some of the additional evaluations in terms of adaptation strategies, which is, do we want to go this route because it's going to cost X number of hundreds of millions of dollars or billions, or do we want to look at a longer term strategy? So I just raised that issue. And then, and perhaps you have an opinion on this, I would be interested in, if not, if staff also could venture here. One of the things that I think of is that the increase, obviously beach nourishment costs are going to increase. And so what does that mean for higher income communities versus lower income communities, given the increased costs and the scarcity of sand? How is that going to be apportioned?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and as we start looking at our different beachfront communities, we know that there's different resources in every different area, but everyone's grappling with the same problem. I'll make a note and I'll let staff chime in as well. One of the key sources of funding for these projects has been grant funding through the California Division of Boating and Waterways. They provide an 85% grant fund, and then 15% is local match. And so when we think about having that as an opportunity, plus having all of these cities band together to share the cost of a dredge, which was mentioned earlier is quite expensive, that starts helping us grapple with some of those large numbers, and maybe making it more affordable for some areas where it's a hard number to tackle. But those thinking about it that way kind of helps us grapple with that.
Well, yes and no, which is yes, if everybody bands together, right, and forms a collaborative and has a region-wide approach to it. However, we also know that it could be possible that individual communities would vie for that resource, and so those who could afford to either make that match or raise that match may have a better shot at that resource. Could staff also, and please stay because I have a couple more questions, any other additional information with respect to that question? Okay, I've got some structural questions that I can ask in a second. Okay, then have you done any work, has SANDAG done any work on the just the general costs of sea level rise. So, which include for public infrastructure, which would include parks, wastewater treatment, utilities, roads, all of that. So to really look at, besides just looking at the adaptation strategy of beach nourishment, the larger question of what these costs are going to look like for a region that's dominated, right, by beautiful beaches and coastline, et cetera.
No, Sandag has not undertaken that kind of economic work. There has been some regional economic studies done on sea level rise and impacts to jobs in our region, which are really interesting, but not on the actual cost of, damages to infrastructure, homes, businesses, things like that.
Do you think that's something that they will be looking at soon?
I do not know, to my knowledge, not at this time.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. I really appreciated your presentation, and if there's a way for us to get your report, perhaps you can provide it to staff and they'll circulate it to us, because those are going to be the kinds of things where we're going to look back at those as we educate ourselves on all of these issues. So really appreciate your work and appreciate your report. Thank you very much.
I'll just maybe add that the information that Greg shared about our regional shoreline monitoring program, the EIRs for the 2 projects that we've done, and a lot of background data is available on the Sandag website as well.
That says, that's great, but I'm probably not going to read a 50,000-page EIR.
We're happy to share the
So,
report.
yeah, so thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. And to staff, I just had a structural, and if you have an opinion on this, please weigh in. One of the things that I wanted to ask is, because you have the expertise, with shoreline protection, with beach nourishment, if there's communities that have shoreline protection, so they've got seawalls and revetments and that kind of stuff happening, when they nourish those beaches, there's still going to be accelerated erosion, right? If those seawalls are still there. What I'm trying to discern is, in the choices that communities are going to make, perhaps some beaches are more amenable to beach nourishment, get a bigger bang for the buck, right? Because they have maybe dunes, or they're not going to be hitting the seawalls and the revetments that we know accelerate beach erosion. So I don't know, sorry if that's not the most coherent way to ask that question, but if you could try to respond to what I'm getting at here.
Sure, Commissioner Brownstein. One comment to your earlier point about sand going to a range of communities, not just to the ones that might have the money to afford it. There are a number of projects that are done at beach nourishment where you place sand in an area, it's called a feeder beach, where then the sand continues to go down coast and it nourishes all the coastal areas down shore of there. Surfside Sunset is a project that the Army Corps of Engineers has done for a number of years, where they place sand at Surfside Sunset, and it goes as far south as Newport. So it is an opportunity to spread the sand wealth throughout the shoreline.
So you're saying that's a bigger bang for the buck?
It is one of the opportunities to have sand move from the intended initial, not the intended initial location, because it was intended as a feeder beach, so that you use sand placement in one location as a regional asset to nourish a number of areas. And sometimes it could be a better way to fund those and have them happen.
Okay.
It also means you have to think about what structures there are in the way to potentially be barriers. As far as the idea that, relative to your question about having armoring on the shoreline, which is then going to stop the introduction of the bluff materials getting to the beach, and then having beach nourishment go in there, I mean, in some locations, there is armoring at the back shore for extreme events and high wave conditions that may be beyond the ability of a beach that comes back every year to provide protection. And so there's a sort of, they work together, and you are right that having the armoring will stop the sand that would have been in the bluff from getting to the beach. So eventually, over time, they may be less and less sand coming from the bluff, so more and more sand need to be replaced because it's not coming in there naturally. Is that answering what you meant
Yeah,
for the
no,
second
that
one?
exactly answers my question, because I think we have to think in a way that we haven't thought before, right? We have to ask these kinds of questions because while sand may be plentiful or available in amounts that are able to sort of keep up with the places where we really feel like those beaches need to be nourished, that's not always going to be the case because of sea level rise, increased storms, et cetera. So I'm just trying to kind of, gather information, try to understand how do we navigate these decisions? And certainly, as a local government representative, it's extremely pertinent to the kinds of queries that you and the other professionals at Sandag are undergoing. So thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Rice.
Yes, thank you. Really fascinating presentations from start to finish. I guess I have a couple questions going along the lines of Commissioner Brownsee's questions. I'm really, but I'm speaking more about sort of the sustainability of doing these kinds of large-scale beach replenishments, the ones we're talking about through Sandag. And I'm thinking about it not just in terms of cost, but I'm wondering about source material, one, given the Florida experience, and then two, going back to Joe, I think it was part of your presentation, talking about how not all beaches have the same kind of material dependent on their conditions, slope, whatever, wherever their natural sources was. And so does the source material exist that matches up well with the beaches? So that was one line of questioning. And then also, and maybe I missed it, did we talk about sort of the biological profile of beaches? I know dunes have a biological profile, and I'm just wondering, and I would guess through the permitting process, the impacts from both the sourcing the material and the depositing of the material is looked at in terms of environmental impacts. But could you just flesh out a little bit about that? Is how do these large-scale beach replenishment projects impact the biology or ecosystem of that beach, of a beach? If that makes sense.
I guess I'll jump in and just maybe say a couple words on the sources of sand. As part of doing these large-scale beach sand projects, we have done offshore sand investigations in the past, which have concluded that right now we're doing okay with our sand supply. We should be able to do more of these projects in the future. However, those studies will continue to need to be updated if this is going to move forward. And so that is something that we've been thinking about as we look to the future, and a lot of the local jurisdictions are thinking about beach sand replenishment. In terms of the biological impacts, there have been environmental impact reports done on both of these projects in the past. And I wasn't here for either of them, so I can't speak to the exact mitigation, but I do know that any impacts were, mitigated to the extent that they could be. And I think a kind of interesting perspective, and I'll point to the Cardiff Living Shorelines project as an example here, is that as we've been restoring our beaches and restoring that dune habitat, there's monitoring that goes along with that. And in the Cardiff area, they're starting to see a lot of species return that haven't been there for a while. And so it's interesting to watch that over time. And I don't know if staff wants to add anything else to that.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that, and I gather actually each of these different situations, you've had mixed results. Some of you've had better results than others. So whether it's the, seeing species come back or maybe a beach not last as long as you would like. Seems like there's no apples to apples necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, all of these areas are very different. And I will just say that for the Sandag projects, there have been, monitoring programs that have been put in place to make sure that, during construction, we're being as environmentally sensitive as we can. And then post-construction, if there's any monitoring that's needed, that is completed.
And then just back to the source material, you said you've done the, what did you call it, offshore?
Yeah, offshore sand investigation.
So that's sort of like oil reserves concept, and as time goes on, the engineering evolves, so your reserves, you find new reserves.
You're exactly
I'm
right.
not saying that that's a good thing, but anyway, go ahead.
I won't add too much, but I like that characterization of sand as a resource very similar to oil. I think, echoing what Sarah says, at least at this point with current demand, my perception is that there is sand out there, but you can't really separate the availability from the cost of going to recover it. I mean, the further out you go, the more, yeah, sure, we could go down to the bottom of submarine canyons with a really long straw and try to suck that up, but now we're talking about astronomical costs. So those two factors are inextricably linked, and and that linkage is going to be even more and more important moving into the future. And it becomes even more difficult when you add the criterion of wanting to make sure that the sand you're putting on the beach is somehow the right size or compatible. And there's trade-offs involved there. There is some recent research out of Scripps showing that beaches where they added larger sand with larger grain sizes performed better under storm conditions than beaches where they tried to match the pre-existing grain size. And, I think I'm certainly not the right person to ask about the ecology of beaches, but I am sort of peripheral to it. And it is kind of an emerging area of science, or at least our awareness of it and our incorporation of it into our decision-making process is emerging. But particularly for large projects, that's absolutely something that we're concerned about. And there's a lot of research out there to suggest that nourishment projects do have substantial impacts, and that the extent to which the beach ecological communities recover, it can take time, and it may not, depending on how frequently you're doing these sorts of projects, you may or may not get back to sort of your baseline. So I think that's probably a good topic for a future briefing by our ecologists.
One more really quick question. So Joe, when you're a geology major, master's, PhD, something like that?
Something like that.
So when you went into geology, did you expect to be becoming a beach expert?
No, I went to graduate school intending to study climate change in the past and how it was going to affect, or what sort of clues that would provide to water resource management in California. So.
Sands of time, that's where that phrase comes from.
Okay, Commissioner Amanzada.
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank staff, and my questions, I think, are mostly for Coastal Commission staff. But thank you, first of all, for initiating these sea level rise briefings. It's been so helpful to deepen the Commission's understanding of some of the ecology issues as we confront these matters in our decision-making. A couple of questions and ideas about how to further link the information we're receiving to the decisions we're making. And maybe this is a good example because we were set to consider Del Mar. Might we consider sort of an interpretation of some of these practices in light of our sea level rise adaptation principles and our guidance? And I know that Leslie showed a slide about sort of what we endeavored to do with respect to coastal hazards. But I wonder if we can increasingly, and moving forward, think about maybe a loading order or some way for both commissioners and the public to process and understand these different tactics, because the comments of Surfrider really resonated with me, that despite all of the good work happening, there's a lot of cause for concern with respect to beach nourishment. And so I think in order for us to be able to process this information and use it in our decision-making, I think we need a little bit more context and guidance as to how to consider beach nourishment when we receive it in future LCPs and other contexts. And so I wonder, for example, if you could speak to, how should we consider beach nourishment as compared to, for example, managed retreat? And in what way are we guiding local entities with respect to making those decisions, understanding that this shorter-term solution may be more appealing for a variety of reasons?
I'll take a crack at that because I've thought about this a lot. The bottom line is this. Beach replenishment, beach nourishment, it should be considered a short-term interim measure in a longer-term phased adaptation plan, as part of a longer-term phased adaptation plan. But it's also important to consider the context of each location, because the circumstances, as these guys pointed out, are different in different contexts. So we have to be able to assess that with each one of these adaptation planning efforts going forward. I worry about the things that we don't know. This is an evolving area of, with climate change and the projections that are out there. Things are happening more quickly than we ever imagined. And scientists are telling us that. So it even makes me more concerned about the, beach nourishment and everyone putting all their eggs in this beach nourishment basket as a longer term strategy. Because just think of the costs associated with these going forward. These local governments cannot afford these large-scale beach nourishment projects. It takes funding from the federal government, and those funds there's going to be competition for those funds across the nation. And so we see here in San Diego, with a 50-year project that hasn't started, we approved that way back several years ago, but that project has not been funded and still isn't funded. And with the collapse of the bluff at Encinitas recently that killed, a tragic bluff collapse that killed those poor 3 people. And that spurred some action on the part of some Congress people to get that money secured and out here. The other thing is that, with the new IPCC study that's out showing that the oceans are warming more quickly, we're going to have increased storm activity in Southern California, around the LA area. They said about 100-year storm every 5 years or so we can expect in the next by 2050. These sort of projections are scary, but we've got to build into these adaptation plans this phasing and building on what the projections and scientific knowledge we're receiving. But it's going to take, to the point that Donna made about the costs around these things, assessing these costs, I think, is really critical. What is the cost, for moving this infrastructure out of harm's way? I think there needs to be a large-scale inventory along the coast, and then prioritizing of our infrastructure. What are our priorities going forward for those sorts of things? But I do think that that sand replenishment is a good short-term adaptation measure. We have a high energy wave regime on the West Coast, a little different than East Coast, although the East Coast is getting hit by all sorts of big, devastating hurricanes. So, it is such a dynamic environment. It's hard to tell what's going to happen. It's arrogant to think that we know what's going to happen and make these decisions. And that shows with the SONGS mitigation program. We made certain assumptions that, how much mitigation would be required and how quickly that could happen. And look how long, that was 1974 when that was first approved and that was built. Yeah, and look how long it's taken the mitigation still hasn't been realized there. So I always take these things in a little humility as we face them, because it's what we don't know that's frightening. And that uncertainty. But I don't know, you guys have any other comments?
Thank you so much. I think I'm wondering too, as we move forward, could we think about some kind of a loading order or prioritization to be even more clear to commissioners and to local governments about if and how these solutions could be used. In other words, like, is beach nourishment an acceptable solution without some thinking about managed retreat and other aspects of adaptation planning? And if it's not, how can we be clearer about that? Because I worry that in the interim, before we're able to achieve a comprehensive inventory, and I know we're aiming at some of those more comprehensive multi-state efforts, we're going to keep pursuing these short-term solutions, which are quite costly, which have ecological impacts, and which may create a false sense of short-term security and allow communities to defer decisions that we really need to be making now. And so I just would encourage us as an agency, and as we're having these fantastic briefings, to think about how to make it clear for commissioners, local governments, and the public of how to contextualize these options, because I worry that otherwise they sound really good and that they're allowing us to defer some sort of deeper decisions that we need to make. And that, you know, maybe we start with some light guidance and context for these presentations. Maybe we're able to build it into our strategy, and then perhaps even have it be tied to funding associated with both planning and preparedness. So just some points to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Wilson.
This button here. There we go. This isn't so much of a question as just sort of an observation, which is the costs you keep talking about, which are great, and the options you're talking about in terms of the technology and or the methodology. Generally speaking, the cost changes are mostly related to the energy consumption of moving masses amounts of materials. And with that energy consumption comes carbon footprint. And so I just want to make sure that that is part of our discussion and our analysis moving forward. And I know that, you know, California CEQA is, asking for that more and more, but I just want to put that in there because so much often what we're doing is, you know, in a lot of these systems, and not necessarily this particular one, but when we're talking about saving highways and things like that, it's like these systems are the systems that are causing the problem to begin with, and there's some fundamental shifts we're going to be making as a society if things are moving as fast as we think they're going to be moving, and trying to be prepared for that. So I just wanted to make sure that our carbon footprint of this particular technology or effort is accounted for. That's all.
Commissioner Hart.
Thank you. I will ask this in a general way to all the presenters because I can't recall who spoke about this, but in the presentation, there was examples of successful beach nourishment, unsuccessful beach nourishment. I understand Torrey Pines got that. Was Del Mar, my understanding is Del Mar was an example of beach nourishment that did not succeed, or maybe I missed something there. So I would just like to return to that for a minute. Whoever presented on that, please. Thank you.
Sure. One thing that we didn't talk about, and it goes back to Dr. Ewing's concept of a feeder beach. So the way Sandag chose to do this project was lots of small nourishments along the coast, and each of those tended to feed adjacent beaches. So even though we weren't able to keep sand at South Carlsbad, it did move down the beach and benefit Bataquitos, Encinitas, and whatnot, things like that. Del Mar, even though they didn't participate in the last regional beach sand project, we saw material from Solana Beach making it into Del Mar as well. So when you look at it in a much broader concept, it's not just where the sand was placed, but where it's going and how it's benefiting the rest of the coast.
So just to be clear, there was no specific, Del Mar itself was not one of the projects that you named, because I thought that it was.
I think if I recall, Del Mar retained wider beaches for about 5 of the years during the period, but we had more sand volume in the system there for, if I recall, is about 14 or 15 years. And that's important as well because it's that material out in the system that's breaking up waves and causing them to break further offshore and dissipate before it gets to the coast.
And that was coming down from the other project, not specifically offshore or on the beach at Del Mar?
No, it's coming down from the other projects. And as we place the material up high on the beach, it's going to spread laterally along the shoreline and also offshore within that zone of active littoral transport.
And also, just to be clear, it's ecologically my understanding, and you can confirm this, that it's better to place the sand in the near shore and then allow it to come in versus putting the sand, bringing all heavy equipment in, et cetera. I mean, from an ecological perspective, which I think Commissioner Brownsey was mentioning, would that be the case?
I think it depends on the location where you're nourishing and what the nearshore resources are like. Some nourishment's placed offshore in a nearshore mound. It's been done at Imperial Beach and it naturally works its way up. When you put it in these smaller pieces up above the water line, it tends to act more like how sand would be brought to the coast from a natural, like a river system, things like that, and then it can spread gently along the coastline.
Okay. Well, that was really very, more? Oh, hi, Commissioner Escalante, I'm so sorry.
I feel left out of this discussion. So, I want to I appreciate everything that the commissioners have said. I especially, what you've said about equity, I think that's very important. The burden to taxpayers and the priorities, I totally agree with Commissioner Amanzada on us moving towards this framework to help us identify where we should be prioritizing. And from my perspective, our geoengineers, this geoengineering way of trying to get ourselves out of, these climate problems, we're kind of working off of this short-term, mindedness, and this is how we got to this problem in the first place. So I'm concerned about the consequences, not just to the environment itself, but also to, this further delaying the kind of action that society or communities need to take on this. And I think this could be a gamble if we only focus on the short-term fixes. One question about the unknowns, and this is just kind of stemming from a conversation I had a long time ago with a PhD from UCLA. They were studying currents and how the chemistry of the oceans affects currents. And you've been talking a lot about currents actually play a lot into kind of how the sand replenishment and sand in general functions around the coast. Are there considerations in terms of what's coming in change of ocean acidification and further pollution of our oceans, of how any of that can impact the currents, and therefore how that would impact the sand conditions along the coast? Another question for another ask of Scripps.
And I know from the USGS and Dr. Barnard's research, he was indicating that you'll see more tropical-related storms coming up the coast that could have major impacts on our shoreline. So that's a different sort of storm scenario than we've seen in the past, where these hurricanes don't curve off out into towards Hawaii, but come up and actually affect Southern California. And that could be a big issue here in San Diego.
One of the things the scientists at Scripps are thinking might happen is that the orientation of our storms and our wave energy is going to shift slightly, so it comes a little bit more from the south, which means that areas that are now sheltered from some major storms will not be sheltered as well in the future. Currents, though, are going to be a significantly different function, because currents are mostly temperature and salinity gradients, and during some of the ice ages and the little ice age, some of the currents have collapsed or changed significantly, but that's more the temperature gradient shifts and not salinity. And I'm going to be quiet now because I'm really getting out of my depth.
Do you want to go? Without getting too far down into the weeds, one of the consequences of adding carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, of warming our atmosphere, is that there's going to be changes and redistributions in the global wind patterns. And that includes the wind patterns over the North Pacific Ocean. And those seasonally shifting, changing wind patterns are to a great degree what govern the currents along our coastline and many other coastlines. So how those actually change, and there's research into that. I can't tell you exactly what it says. I come back next month and give you a whole nother briefing if you want, but I think that's a real wild card, and Leslie alluded to some of the changes that are considered to be likely or possible in the context of beach nourishment and sand transport. You know, we've been operating under a system where there are these sort of prevailing patterns of north to south transport, predictable over time. If those start to change, that changes the equation for our beaches and our, any efforts to use sand as a protection strategy. And
Okay, I think we got to start moving along here. This is going to be a half day. Commissioner Padilla has one last word. Is there anyone else that I missed?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just very briefly, just to kind of bring it back to the core, thanks for the download and the briefing, both from our staff and certainly from Sandag, and for your patience. I would just echo a couple things to remember that in the long run, I think it's pretty apparent that this strategy has primarily and fundamentally more adverse environmental impact than it does positive. It's certainly not economically sustainable in the long run. And I would echo my colleagues, and particularly Commissioner Amanzada, that we really need to continue working to develop ways to incentivize and, if necessary, disincentivize decision-making at the local level and work in strong partnership to end up with local governments having a broader suite of options to adapt and to create adaptation strategies for sea level rise. This is some interesting stuff, but I think if we lose sight of the fact that this is not sustainable in the long run, then we're losing sight of the fundamentals, and ultimately we need to do better. So I would just echo those comments and wanted those comments on the record. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. Okay.
We just need to change out some staff here, so maybe just a real short break might be
If we take a short break, I'm going to lose these people.
okay. No short break.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Okay, 10 minutes. If I see you all back here at 3:32.